Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us. My name is Brad Kemp with Schoology here, and welcome to another Schoology Leap. Today, I'm very excited that we're going to be doing a live course build. We talk a lot about big ideas here at Leap, and then we drill into some specifics, but sometimes it's nice just to sit in the platform and build some work based off of some common resources, because that, at the end of the day, that's what a lot of us are doing. I would like to welcome my friend and colleague out in Sauk Rapids, Ann Cameron. Ann, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, Ann Cameron. I'm from Sauk Rapids, Minnesota, and I'm an instructional coach in technology integration and one of our Schoology administrators here in our district.
So, Ann, you work with teachers and sounds like in all grade levels, helping them make that transition to including digital instruction in a meaningful way.
Yes, I do.
We've talked a lot about, as we were planning this, that many times we've checked ourselves and say, well, let's not put anything in the course that's just tech for tech's sake. And it sounds like that's your motto over there.
Absolutely is. It needs to have a value, and it needs to enhance and increase student engagement and really benefit them and increase their ability to master the content.
Great. And let's do a quick check-in with everybody. I'm going to share my screen now. You should all see this big mind map of my screen, and hopefully you're all hearing me. If this is your first time at Leap, you have the opportunity to ask us questions in the chat window. Those questions go directly to myself, and I can respond to those and bring them up in conversations and send information back to you. So let's just make sure everyone knows where that is, and just let me know where you're joining us from, where, if in the U.S. or elsewhere. You'll hear with the crazy weather we've been having over here, it was 60 one day, then we got 8 inches of snow. I'm still nursing some sickness over here. Let me know if you are in the same boat. I can't exactly share my lemon ginger tea with honey at this time, but you'll be sure that you'll be seeing a lot of this at this Leap today. Welcome Ashley from Wisconsin, Jennifer, Michigan, Robert, LA. We are coast to coast today. Courtney from Texas. I got a great suggestion from Rod Kirby to improve my concoction here, but I'll keep that to myself. But I will take that advice. Thank you. Lori. And today I'm honored to even have my colleague Joe Vassallo, who sits about 10 feet that way. I expect a lot of peanut gallery today. Okay, so as you are all joining us, we're doing something a little bit different today than what we usually do at Leap. Usually in the morning and afternoon sessions, we present the exact same content. Of course, maybe a little bit different depending on your questions. Because this is such a broad topic and both sessions are being recorded, we're going to pick up from where we left off this morning so that you can go back and look at both videos together and get the whole story. But we will first do a debrief of what we covered this morning. Basically today, we're going to continue building a course that we started building this morning. Now, Ann, this morning we did not just dive right in to my humanities course here and started building, did we?
No, we did not. We did a lot of analysis first.
Did a lot of analysis first. So as we were putting this presentation together, Ann and I built this mind map here, and I'm going to put that in the chat window so you all can grab it, check it out. And we spent a lot of time talking about these first couple of phases here. The idea that when you have, let's say you have a lot of curriculum, digital curriculum, maybe some of you are part of the Open Ed initiative to create open courseware as a charter. Definitely let me know in the chat window if you are. I'd love to know about that. But it can be awfully tempting to just jump in those materials right away and just copy and paste in Schoology, start making stuff. But a lot of that effort can be fruitless, can be lost if that initial analysis and design was not considered up front. So I would say I'm going to take an attempt here and try to make a big summary so we can jump into it. And if you want to drill down deeper, everybody, you can look at our recording from this morning that will be on YouTube later. I'd say from the analysis perspective, I'm going to bring up my pen here. From the analysis piece, well, there's the where, when, who is being taught. Is this in the classroom? Is it blended, or is it virtual? Is it somewhere in between? Then, right up front, who are our learners? And by knowing more about our learners, what can be personalized? It's what our mantra is at Schoology. We want to be able to personalize. We want to build tools so you all can personalize education. And that can be all well and good. The tools may be there, and we may all have the best intentions, but if we just start building courseware, we might, you could design yourself into a corner and not be able to personalize something later. So we want to think about that up front. And that goes from things like reading levels to motivation agency to people's comfortability or even the availability of technology to begin with. And this, I gotta say, this is one that's so simple, but it's one of my favorites. What are our opportunities for interaction? Interaction between the instructor and the student, interaction between students themselves, and interaction between the student and the content, to really think of that content as a living and breathing part of the class culture, that as the community, we want to be able to interact with that content in some way. One of the biggest benefits of technology, right? Then, okay, so that's the analysis part. Anna, how am I doing so far? Did I get that right? You want to add anything? Any flavor there?
You're great.
And a couple people have asked for a copy of this. You should. That's the link that I just put in. It's from the site Coggle. That is actually a really nice extension you can add to your Google Drive as well. These mind maps. So Jen, let me know if you don't see that in the chat window. Catherine, great to see that you are doing OER. I'd love to know more about that. Email me later at leap@schoology.com. Okay, then, and there are going to be a lot of people stalking you on Twitter after this because there is so much hype about this morning, housekeeping, that before we even look at the content, there is a lot of housekeeping we can do, a lot of things we can build in our course before we even look at the subject matter almost. Talk to me a little bit about what you do there, because I do think it's unique, and I think you are going to have some fans wanting copies of what you do out there.
All right, and much of this housekeeping piece comes from my experience as a Quality Matters course reviewer. So these are things that, in order to be compliant with national and international standards for online course design, these are the types of things that need to be in all online courses, whether or not they are fully online, blended, or some other version. And so I like to think of these as templates that provide a consistency across a learning environment. So for instance, in our high school, and actually across our district, we create a course resources folder which serves as a template for all of those important documents, important pieces of information that are accessible to both parents and learners. So things like internet agreements, Schoology codes of conduct, the course syllabus, links to online textbooks. And what's nice about these is we send out an overall shell that's district-wide, and then individual departments can take these and customize for their own use as well. So they can add, department-specific resources and things like that. But these are just some of the basics for overall general compliance.
So if I could illustrate that, it sounds, tell me if this is right, it sounds like, I brought up my little board here, it sounds like there's some templating here that has to do with a lot of compliance and basic structure, so that when a student goes into a course, no matter who's teaching it, it has a very similar look and feel. They don't have to start hunting for a list of resources or guidance. And
Correct.
then that resource is available at more of a group level to take that template and maybe add some stuff, modify some stuff that might be particular to the language arts department or something like that.
Correct.
And then I'm guessing that your individual teachers over here could come in and pull that in from a resource into their course.
And that's exactly what we do. We keep it in a tech integration group resource, and teachers pull that across. They customize it, add it to their own resources, and then go from there and pull it into all of their course sections. So they're really only editing one time.
Great. Sounds like a great process you've developed there. Okay, let me bring back my screen. So that takes a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of questions that sometimes I see of, well, if I'm using discussion boards, how do my students know, what kind of code of conduct, you've shelved that whole thing.
Absolutely.
I like that.
That's something that I would recommend going through in a course orientation, and that too is that course orientation piece can come in a variety of different modes, but that too is part of the standard for online course design. Mm-hmm. Students should have the ability to easily understand the overall purpose of the course and then the direction that they take in completing all of the outcomes and learning activities.
Mm-hmm. And it's nice to be able to try to prevent that, well, like, why am I taking calculus? How am I going to use this in my life?
Exactly.
Okay, that's great. We got a nice question here. How do you send out a specific shell? Is that created in Schoology? Yeah, I think the idea here is that you might create a shell of some kind, and then if you're creating that in your courses, to save that whole shell to your resources. That would pop over here. And if you're working with a small group, you might be using a collection, a resource collection. That's great for small group work. So let's say we have an instructional design group here, right? And notice I'm not using a Schoology group here. I'm using a collection because maybe there are just a couple of us who do this. Maybe I'd use a group if it's a bigger group. And then either by creating a shell in a course and then saving that into here, I can share that with other really high-level stakeholders, and I can give them viewer edit permissions here as well. So that's a good place to do that. So for instance, I might take some of this and save it to that collection I just created. So I just clicked Options, Save to Resources, and then here are all of my personal resources and group resources. There's that instructional design collection I just created. That's going to be packaged up over here. Sometimes it takes a minute to come over, depending on how much materials there were. This will probably take a couple minutes. But then, for instance, look at one of these other collections. I could take this, and I would usually either, depending on what I'm doing, move it to a group resource if it was final, or duplicate it, make a copy of it, and copy it to, here are my group resources, faculty template resources. So I might have a group in Schoology called faculty templates. And then any teacher who is a member of that group, let's say I'm teaching a different course over here, I can import from resources and look at my groups, faculty template resources. There we go. And there's a good starting point. Okay. Now that was a quick version. That was very quick. If you want to think more about handling resources and saving from courses to resources, go to Schoology's YouTube channel.com. Let's say there's something called a micro lesson saving courses, something like that. There we go. Let me just get the share link
materials
to you.
between.
I'll just put this in chat for you. These are two good resources on how to handle courses, transitioning over to resources, and back again. This one is saving courses. There you go. And there's another slightly longer video about the other side of that, is taking the course that is in resources and then restarting it. I find, I just did all of that very quickly. I find that I really like watching these videos because I can pause them and then do it myself a little bit. So these are great if this is your first year with Schoology and haven't rolled over the year before. My favorite little resources there. Okay, and we promised this would be a very hands-on, no slides, all Schoology session, so we just got a little bit of that. So is that, when I work with a small group, Anne, I really like using those collections and sharing them because it's a really nice specific workspace, and it doesn't need all the hoopla that groups have. But when I create templates for a larger group of instructors, I like groups for a distribution. That's how I think of it. Do you guys do something similar? Have you taken a different approach there?
We have an integration group for each building. Some of the resources are similar, and of course that way we can roll things over from group to group pretty efficiently. But we do have hundreds and hundreds of staff, so we do find that the group resource is the best place for that. And then we have a variety of admins in the group who can add resources to it. Yeah,
absolutely. You can tell that I have this demonstration, very simplified example in this like perfect tiny little school, one cute little group there. Of course, most of you would have lots of groups probably based on in secondary. You probably have things based on subject areas, and in primary, possibly by grade levels. But that's not a hard and fast rule. It's just a kind of middle ground. Cool. So we did all that housekeeping stuff, and then we started talking about building the content. And that's really where we left off, was this idea of taking content and actually putting it in Schoology, finding opportunities to personalize that content and differentiate it as well. And one thing that I like here is that, way back here, when we first started talking about analysis, yes, some of this could be done before you start, but some of that analysis might be done on the, first day of the semester, of the course, once you actually have the real, humans in the chairs, right? Or in the virtual chairs. So notice that one of our first ideas here is integrating things like surveys into the course materials to actually gather that information. Because, Anne, you mentioned to me the idea that, well, what if we put a lot of technology in the course, but our students actually don't have internet at home, they don't actually have devices, or yes, we have a one-to-one program, but those devices can't go home. I don't think we can just take for granted that everyone's going to have access to technology, but I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know of really anyone who has like solid data on their students of who has access and who doesn't.
No, not unless you collect it yourself, which is kind of a practice that I use through a technology survey. So right at the beginning of the course, as part of my course orientation completion folder that I make, as students are stepping through a variety of different tasks, one of the things I ask them to do is to complete a technology survey so that I can have a good grasp on what devices they've used and are comfortable with, what types of hardware, software, what their comfort level is with technology, how they feel about learning new technology and so forth. And then based upon that collected data, I'm able to make a lot of my decisions in terms of the modalities and the extra tech that I'm bringing into the course.
Yeah, and a great point from Rebecca here, that just because they have the technology doesn't necessarily know that they know how to use it.
Exactly.
It's like that common misconception that happens lately is, oh, well, especially if you're in the K-12 world. For those of you on the call that are in higher ed, we're actually looking at higher ed material today. Maybe for you too, but there's this big misconception in K-12 that, oh, well, kids these days, they know all the technology, the Snapchat, the da-da-da. It's like, no, they don't. Just because they have it doesn't actually know that they know how to use it and know all the features or where everything is, and you know how to use it intelligently. If you ever want a good read on that, check out Alan November's blog or any of his books. He's on Twitter, I think Global Learner, something like that. He has a great expose on how he teaches kids how to use Google. That is hilarious, but accurate.
One of the things that I like to do too, Brad, along the way, since you're making design decisions along the way, if I decide on using a specific tool, I like to use the update polls and just send out a quick question. How many people have used it? How comfortable are you with it? Before I actually integrate it in the class as well. That's helpful along the way.
Great point. Right. So we don't have to necessarily go as deep as creating a Google form or a Survey Monkey, something like that. Sometimes this data, you don't need to know the specific of who is who just to get a pulse on your students. So, talk a little bit more about that, Anne, and I'll create that poll.
So just some simple questions. If I'm using for instance, if I'm using Google Story Builder, which is one of the tools that I would like to use in one of the activities in the course for the kids how to do a characterization kind of thing. So that's a great tool to use. It integrates well with Schoology, and so I would just throw out a question. How confident would you be, to teach someone else how to use Google Story Builder? Because if you can teach someone else, you've got a pretty good grasp on it.
Mm-hmm.
So just a simple question, and you could put in whatever scale you would like. The more fun, the better, of course, at K-12 level.
Exactly.
So individuals, just getting that overall pulse on your course.
Exactly. I always like to phrase questions like that as not how confident are you, because everyone is just, oh yeah, sure, no problem. Just, well, could you teach it to somebody else? And they get a little, I feel like sometimes you get a little more honesty there.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, so this course that we're going to build, would you all like to join it? There's the access code. So, excuse me. So a great starting point that a lot of this analysis can be done in the course using these kinds of tools, depending on how sophisticated you want to be. Actually, maybe that's a bad phrase. Sophistication is not necessarily a good thing. It's just what kind of data do you actually need? Do you need data of individuals, or do you just need a general pulse of the class? Okay, so this is what you're looking at right now is what we started with this morning. And here are the open courseware materials that we are looking at. This is an open public access Google folder, so you can go into that too. I just put it in the chat window. One of the first things we talked about that can be done as a guide before anything gets created is just building shells. We already talked about shells being a template, but all of those resources might be a template. The shell for the actual course, the flow of the course, may not, but probably doesn't exist if this is a new course or something just coming into the platform. So Anne, you mentioned to me when we were looking at this, well, why don't we just build the modules? I kind of like the idea of just building folders, and then you have a roadmap, and I think it also gives me, at least me as a teacher and instructional designer, gives me a sense of, well, how much left do I have to do? We talked a lot about this morning as well, about, do we have to build all the course at once, or can we do a little bit as we go? How do you feel? I think that's really subjective depending on the situation, but how do you feel about that, Anne? And those of you on the line here, if you have any feedback on that. Go for it, Anne.
I just like to get the overall framework in, and so there'll be a certain portion that's done, but I like to be real flexible throughout the course and kind of base the materials on student feedback and understanding along the way. So kind of monitor it and adjust, as we do so much in education, throughout the building process. So the core elements are there, the outcomes are there. I've likely picked the major learning activities that match or align to those objectives, but many different times the modalities of those will change, or the deliveries will change of that based upon student understanding.
Absolutely. So I mean, someone gave me a very sort of like the measuring stick that they use, just you know how when you are, especially in the K-12 world, you have so much content to cover, so many courses, so many different students, that there's just that thing of, well, if I'm just, yes, I may have like last year's lesson plans that I may have already revised during the summer, but still I'm going to want to adjust that. If I can just stay about a week and a half, 2 weeks ahead, then I'm good. And I think that actually is a totally perfect analogy for your Schoology courses. Build out the shells, but the content in the shells will just stay about 2 weeks ahead, and that way you don't end up building something totally concrete that you want to throw out and change because your relationship with the students has changed.
And also this morning we talked about having grading groups based upon things like reading levels and Lexile scores. Well, we could only hope that students are going to progress throughout the term, and so if we preload all of those materials ahead of time, we're not going to be able to adjust as students progress and increase their mastery and so forth. So you can only go so far out if you're going to do those types of differentiation activities.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at one of the challenges with open resources is digging into them, and I think getting into the details, and then once you get into the details, figuring out where things go. So let's start with that top level, like a little bit like we did this morning, and drill right into some of the more exciting things in this course. Anne, I see a bunch of modules here, 10 modules. I don't think I'm going to go into my course and just call them Hume 101, Module 1, Module 2, Module 3. Not the most interesting way to go, right? And we had the designer of this course on this morning, and one of the more poignant things she said is, never let anything be boring. A lot of times in open resources, what you're seeing is almost a very library model of the course, so it's very neatly organized. That doesn't mean you should design it that way. So when you look at open resources, one of the first things you want to look for is something that does have all the course objectives, and especially something like a course map on it. And that usually has every module broken down with actual chapter titles and objectives and things like that. So that's where we started. We looked at the modules and objectives. So if I'm creating let's say I was creating module 3 here, I would copy this title, jump into my course here. You see I have module 1, module 2, and they aren't just boring folders, right? I pop in the module number with the title that I'm pulling out of a course map, which you can usually find. This is similar to what you'd find in maybe a scope and sequence in K-12. And then all the learning objectives, well, we always talk about how important it is for students to know what the objective is in a course, but where does it go? Does it go in a page? Do we build out learning objectives in our resources? Maybe, we'll talk about that. But, I mean, it doesn't get more convenient than this, I think, is just put the learning objectives in the folder description. A lot of times I see people not utilizing this folder description. And one of my favorite tools here, Anne, is if you're copying and pasting something from open resources, it'll often come over with the fonts and all sorts of other things, clear formatting. And that'll strip everything down to the baseline Schoology fonts, clean up everything up. I find bullets to be particularly wily, so sometimes I clean those up. But that, took me a couple of seconds there, and now we have a nice folder. Okay. So I think that's our first step. Now, Anne, let's look at that first module, right?
Okay.
What we want to do is look at a couple of these activities these should be activities that are in the basic lesson plan, and then what we want to end with is they have in this course a final, a capstone project. That could be very interesting. I'm going to put this link that we're looking at directly in the chat window if you want to look at the same page as well. I find it very delightful when things are actually organized in a Google Doc. And you talked this morning a lot about how important it is sometimes to design things on paper as well. I think it's a pretty standard thing for course designers who are, you think of them as these just technology-centric people. How many of us course designers do things on paper? It's really important to separate that design process from the building process, because I feel like you can get tunnel vision. That's how I feel like it can be if you're just in the LMS.
Very true, very true.
I like Google Docs because as we look at this standard courseware, there's a little comment button. So we can be doing some designing in here as well. So I can label things as maybe this is a discussion. If this is a blended activity, I can say in class, labeling this to not go in the LMS, but maybe there could be a recording posted later to archive. So I can start adding some ideas and notes here. This can be particularly important if you're working on the syllabus with someone else, if you're not just in your own little world, as sometimes we tend to be. And I'd love to talk about the weekly reflection. How would this is, if you look through all the materials, we would find that there's a weekly reflection. It's a common assessment, and in all the modules is a weekly reflection. And this is usually asking to reflect on the reading, compare and contrast, in this case modern day cultural indicators with examples from the readings, and to write about it. That's the idea. How I can think of like 10 different ways to do this, and here's a challenge for those of you in chat. Just off the top of your head, how would you put that in Schoology? Definitely more than one way. And how do we want to do this today?
Well, given the fact that there are also discussions, and sometimes multiple discussions within each module, to me a reflection is a real personal piece. So it's an individual's perspective that can be very creative. It can be in stark contrast to the next individual, which is what humanities is all about. And so what I would decide to do with the weekly reflection is I would create an individually assigned discussion for each student. And I would put those all together in a reflection journals folder, probably nested outside of all of the modules. And again, individually assigned so that only the individual student and me, the instructor, would be able to see them. Even though we want students to be interacting with other students and the content all the time, again, that reflection piece can be a real individualized thing. And sometimes students do a better job if they know their opinions and things aren't at risk of exposure to others. So I feel like you get a more authentic, creative response.
So let's say I did create reflection module 1, and I could pop in here. Simply copy that, pop it in here, and then what's my favorite tool, folks? Clear formatting. And I probably take out that bullet. Sometimes I like making everything 14. I used to have everything in such small fonts. I don't like small fonts anymore. I'm almost 40. I can't do 12 point anymore. No, thank you. Okay, so I have my weekly reflection there, and I might change my formatting a bit. There we go. And there we go. Weekly reflection module 1. Now, Anne, you made me think of one thing that could make some people think, oh, this already sounds like a lot of work. You said that you wanted one of these for every student.
I do. So I would create one.
I just like formatted this and everything. Do I have to do this all over again?
Nope. I toss it into resources and bring it back in duplicate from there.
Okay, so I'm going to I'll go here and assign this to Amy. I don't know if she's on the line right now. And then now this is the idea of the templates we've been talking about. I'm just going to save this one item to resources. All right. In my instructional design collection here. Now that's going to serve as a template. Even if, for those of you who haven't used resources a lot, even if the student had already responded to something like this, let's say I want to save something mid-year, when you save something to resources, it does strip out any of the interactions, any of the grades. It's just saving the core content there. So I can go back in here. I don't even have to go to my resources. Just clicking that green dotted line. Instead of creating a new discussion, import from resources. And there's my group, there's my reflection. Okay, and sometimes there are some advanced options you could set right away. For instance, if you're setting due dates, we generally don't need those in these instances. So this is something you could do up front, right? And then you do it the first week, and then you're kind of done. The main thing you need to do here is just individually assign it to the next student. Okay. So I usually go, alphabetical, and just get that done. And and someone mentioned this earlier in this morning session, but you would probably maybe when you brought these in, besides individually assigning them, maybe probably changing the name.
Correct. Definitely.
Right. Naming conventions so important.
And that's something to be cognizant all the way through as we're building this course. We have to keep accessibility and universal design for learning principles in mind, because not all our learners are the same, and some are using things like screen readers. So color is great, but we also have to remember that people that are color vision impaired, they're not going to be able to tell the difference between folders. Yep. So you can really label well with text as we go through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Some other ideas to talk here. There's not necessarily one right way to do this, which I think is really important. Is this almost same conversation we had planning this? Well, what about an assignment? Why would we use a discussion here instead of an assignment? Really, we could go different ways. Let's talk about that a little bit. What are the benefits of doing it this way instead of doing it this way? Back to Amy. This is a great question for the gallery. So if you all have some ideas here, if we are Schoology whizzes, what's our what's our benefit ratio here between a discussion assignment? With every decision, almost, right, any instructional design decision, when there's more ways than one to do something, you usually get some benefits with one way. You know, you're giving and taking a little bit, depending on which way you're doing it.
And what are you looking to pull out of it? I like the history piece, having it all in one spot in the discussion thread, so I can kind of take a broad look overall and see what type of growth has taken place.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the biggest factors that I like.
Mm-hmm.
I still have the ability to add audio. I still have the ability to upload, you know, files and embed content and so forth along the way. I can grade it if I choose to, but I don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
And I can look student specific as well. Some of the tools that are available with the discussions.
So one idea here is that everything is in one place. The student could do reflections over several weeks in the same discussion board, and especially if you're focusing on a reading improvement, you could really see a change. I like that archival idea. Now, you have a give and take here in that, well, that would assume, if I'm reading this the right way, that would assume each week I would go in here and add the next week's weekly reflection, or I could stream that a little bit by just changing a link to maybe a Google Doc that has the prompt in it.
That's how I would have done a Google Doc, or I could create a page and link it out to the page. I could upload a document and preload all of the prompts if I wanted to, but I like to integrate the Google Doc so that if anything changes along the way and I want to add or edit anything along the way, I can do that.
Mm-hmm. So check this out. I'm going to riff here for a second. If this is weekly reflection 1, here we go. Excuse me. Week 1. Okay. And then this is good to go, and you can, there are like 1.5 million ways to bring Google Docs into Schoology. You can use the integration. You can not use the integration. Doesn't matter too much. The idea is that you would probably make this shareable so that anyone can view it, whether in your organization or anyone at all. This usually doesn't matter too much with something like a weekly reflection. The NSA is not going to be trying to find out what your weekly reflections are. So you can publish it to the web, and then you could either, one interesting way to do this is to go over here and do a publish to the web, which makes it, gives you a special embed code here. This is one of the ways I like doing this. And then I could go back into our reflection here, and instead of hard coding, let's say, our reflection in here, what this is, if I kept it going this way, every week I'd have to go in here and edit every single discussion and update the reflection, or post to the discussion board the new reflection. That's too much work. That does get a bit too much. So going along that idea and that you're mentioning using the Google Doc, this is what we would call, in the, if we want to use fancy terms, a single source content management. The idea is if you're ever using something more than once, find a way to have a single source of that information and bring it in everywhere. So here I'm going to use that embed code, insert content, our favorite button in Schoology. I can talk forever about insert content. I know some other people online who can too. Here's one of my favorite tricks. If we really want to get in the weeds here, I always find the 4 o'clock crew wants to get in the weeds more. Get comfortable with HTML. This is all you need to know. Iframes are usually fixed height and width, which means if you're looking on a mobile device or screens of different sizes, you might get unexpected results because they'll carry over the page because they're fixed. Now change your width 200% here, so at least it'll snap to the width of the frame you're using. It's a really nice way to do things. Okay, and there's my weekly reflection. And guess what, people? Guess what, my people? When I go back into my courseware, we're in Module 1. Let's say we go into week 2 here. And here's our week 2 weekly reflection. Guess what I'm going to do? Who can guess it? Week 2. Week has passed. My class is just, they're growing leaps and bounds. So I put that in here. And now, if I've used this model in every discussion board, I don't think I have my refresh rate on. Hold on. Yeah, it should be refreshing momentarily. This should be updated. Usually takes a minute with Google for this, but the week 2 will just open there. So if I spent the time to make 30 different individualized weekly reflection boards, then the content itself put in Google Docs or somewhere like that, so that you can change that content in one place and have it reflected everywhere. It's a very cool trick. That publishing mode is not the only one available to you. You could also take this whole thing, put it in iframe. There are a lot of other ways to share Google Docs. Do you have a specific way you do that? Do you just, because you could also just add it as a link. You don't necessarily have to do a fancy embed thing.
I like to embed it.
Yeah. We're big fans of embedding here.
And with Google Forms and things like that, it's nice for if you're showing a video or something and you have just some questions to go along with it for feedback. It's nice to put those in a Google form and then just embed the form so they see the form right underneath. And it's published to you.
Yeah, that is, I think that's like the 2.0, the aha moment with embeds is you can embed more than one thing.
Yes.
And there are like brains that explode because that's such a new thing. Now, we just went down the full rabbit hole of just using a discussion for a reflection. There is the argument of using an assignment for the reflections, and we could do the same trick here of using Google for the submissions themselves, rather for the content, for the prompts. Simply take that out, pop in an iframe. If you're a nerd, code it yourself. Okay. Put in the Google Doc, width equals 100%. Height doesn't matter too much. 500 is fine. Frame. All right, and then there's a nice yellow box. Now we get to see if I make a mistake in a public space. Okay. And there's that other way to embed the Google Doc is actually with the various tools. This can be interesting if you want to enable not only viewing but commenting. It can get pretty interesting. Now, in this case, instead, someone could add submissions. Hey, my friend on the line right now, Joe Vassallo, calling your name. Join my course and make some submissions here. I'm going to unindividually assign this. Or anyone here, go ahead and make some submissions to this. If you're in my course right now, the week 1, module 1 reflection. And what I'd like you to do is make one submission and then make a few more submissions, because that's where it gets interesting. In a discussion board, it's nice that you can see all the text at once, right? From all the posts. What you get with with assignments is you get the revisions. So it's the same concept. You can use one assignment for lots of submissions, and just because we call them revisions doesn't mean you have to use them as revisions. They can just be simply multiple submissions, right? Yeah, so give that a try, make some submissions, and we can look at that example if someone wants to be brave and make some fake reflections. But I think either way is good. Both ways support grading, both ways support rubrics, both ways support following ongoing growth. I think for me, and this goes to Rod and some other people who asked this, here's what I think, thinking on my toes here, what one of the biggest differences from an instructional standpoint, from a design standpoint. Discussion threads, really great for just a paragraph or two. But if this was a composition seminar and I want students to write maybe a couple of pages, we're hitting limits there, okay? That discussion board is going to get unruly, and it's going to start being a little more challenging for you to read. With assignments, if you want, often with a reflection, you just want to be having students write and give response on the content. But again, maybe if this is a composition class, you would actually want to talk a little bit about form and grammar and things like that that are sometimes ignored in other subject reflections. The assignment pathway is also going to give you those annotation tools. So if you need that extra layer of complexity and longer submissions, maybe with images and some other stuff, assignments might be the way to go. But assignments have so many features that it's a little bit bulky of a decision. If you just want these short, a couple of paragraphs, a discussion might be a better way to go. Someone else also mentioned the idea of using the Schoology blog on a profile. That's a really interesting way to go, but you have to be really creative on how to score them or grade them. And excuse me. And they are a public forum, or rather, within the school. So this could be interesting for a journalism major, someone like that, who you actually want them practice putting things out there, and to have that risk and exposure, that could be pretty interesting. Same thing with the portfolios, could be interesting for art majors. Could be very interesting. I would say for art majors, maybe doing galleries, but remember, you can't individually assign a media album. Okay, so that I probably wouldn't toy with that at this point. And so we've talked a lot about this, and that's a little, like, really what I wanted to do this with this webinar is tweeze out, this is a whole curriculum, and we just talked about a considerable amount of time about weekly reflections. There's so many different ways you could do this, and it's not just like choosing one. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. So sometimes when Anne and I and our panelists this morning, we were all talking about sometimes people are really enthusiastic. They get Schoology, they want to transform learning, which I'm very excited about, to say, can you just take this and build it in Schoology? That'd be great. My teachers would love to see that. And while you could do that, it's not a best practice. It's not the way to go. You miss the whole analysis piece, and you miss understanding the nuances to your toolbox. And then everything you're transformed, instead of transforming at this level, you're going to be transforming at a very, very low level because you're not fine-tuning that toolbox and thinking of these different scenarios. So slow and steady wins the race. I should also add the caveat, Anne, of you will always change your mind about something too.
Absolutely. I find just designing out of the box like that takes 5 times as long. It's much better to take the time up front, think it through, organize, and then the design process is very, very, very quick.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad that someone asked me what would this look like in the student view. Ah, I see. I have some submissions here. So this is what I'm seeing as the teacher. Oh, yes, very nice, Jennifer. This is actually a great point in multimedia. Yes, you can attach images and links to a discussion thread, but if you want it to be a more ingrained experience, like this one, assignment submissions do give you some more flexibility there. Okay, so I could be toggling through these revisions as for each weekly reflection. Revision 1, reflection 1, you know, etc. So that's a really interesting way to go. And someone asks, how would this look like to a student? Well, you have all the tools you need right in front of you. Your best friend when you start really differentiating things is this option here. Click Course Options, View Course As, and this allows you to load your course as any of the students in it. So we were just looking at Jennifer, so I can actually load my course as it looked like to her. Okay, and notice she doesn't see those discussion boards. Why? Remember, we individually assign them to other students. Okay, so and this assignment, we removed the individual assigned so you could all see it. So that's the best way to do that. What's nice about this view is that it does prevent you from accidentally making a comment. How many of you seen the movie Up? It's one of my favorite movies. There's a point when the talking dog sees is in mid-sentence, and so it's like, squirrel. That's me. You know, if I'm in here viewing my course as a student, someone asks me a question, I completely forget that I'm in here as a student. I try to start building, grading. Schoology will prevent you from making any of those mistakes if you have a similar squirrel problem that I do. And back to course. Okay, so the idea of individually assigning, creating grading groups and things like that, that the whole point of that is for it to look different and be a different experience for different students. With some of our last time here, let's jump over and look at that Capstone project that finishes up this course. Okay, so this is a big creative project, and students have a lot of choice in it. I mean, if we thought a simple reflection, you know, there's more than one way to do things. This really has more than one way to do things. And how are we approaching this?
Well, I like to use Schoology tools whenever I can, and there's a variety of options we could use. For one thing, this is all about humanities and different perspectives. I would let the students, as much as possible, make their choice as to the tool that they want to use. So I could, in fact, let them use different tools and then have them put it all together in a Schoology portfolio, which is the approach that I would probably use. Because you could use timeline tools, you could grab videos or create your own videos, you could find images and things like that, but put it all together in a Schoology portfolio and you've got a great representation of a project, I think. It's a great tool. Use it all the time.
And the key here is, remember, the portfolios are not in the course. They're part of the student's profile. And my favorite thing about them is that they follow a student year to year. They keep this thing. This is real ownership, and that's one of my favorite things about this stuff.
And Brad, what I actually would do is I think I would create a student completion folder just to kind of create some benchmarks for the Capstone project, and knowing that as students submit portions of that, they can pull right from their assignments and things in the portfolio. They can pull those assignments in. So a little scaffolded.
Yeah, so I'm going to bring that up in two tabs here. And realize this, because you just said a lot of important things. So the idea is that with this, it's not just one assignment. Now we're doing some project management. Right, we're asking students to really manage this, and we're going to probably want to set some benchmarks. So the first one of those, in this example here, where did I put it? Let me find it. Everyone gets different choices and ideas, right? That's
Correct.
pretty interesting. So I'm just going to kind of riff here for a second and think off the top of my head, and just interrupt me when you have when you want to. You all in chat too. It is 5 o'clock, by the way. We're just going to go a few minutes over here because this is fun stuff. Hopefully most of your days are done. So we might start off with an ideation discussion board. Are you writing about? And so I'm not going to spend time having you watch me type, but here we could encourage people to do some initial ideation, to share some ideas. Oh, I'm thinking about doing this. Of course, with any discussion, we like to have some components, just not, well, what's your idea? But I would say something like, have a prompt for the idea itself. What do you think the risks are? Or even better yet, why is this exciting? And then what are the risks? So now we can actually get students responding to each other of, wow, that is exciting, or hey, there is this thing you haven't thought about, or you can get some little peer review happening. But, and the first piece of this is the idea, and the one thing we don't want to have happen is everyone just copying, let's wait till Sarah posts her brilliant idea, and then we'll all copy that one. So we add that require posts option, which is our favorite. So this is going to make everyone post their idea before they can read everyone's responses. There we go. And I mentioned project management. Got the due date on it. And if we want to grade this in chunks, we could even grade and give everyone just a 10 points, complete, incomplete for this, or not grade it, either way.
And one thing
that's in the Capstone project, if any of you want to play around with that and just see how that require post option works if you haven't seen it before.
And I noticed the instructor in this course was kind of a stickler on late work and so forth, wasn't going to take it, so that lock feature is going to be great as part of this or other assignments as well.
Absolutely. So this is a higher education course, and in almost every single university professor, unless you were my philosophy professor who, God love her, she was really lenient, but any other professor does not let you turn in late work. It's like, it's a thing. Go to college. There's no such thing as late work. It doesn't exist. That's why Schoology has a 11:59 timestamp, is that's a kind of a gold standard in higher education. So if we want to make this a little bit more real, we could also lock this as well. February. And I can lock it the same day. Or, okay, it's due at midnight. I go to the 18th, make it due at 12 a.m. And by the way, you high school teachers who are attempting to convince your high schoolers to do things like sleep instead of start their work at midnight, making something due at midnight and locking it sure does get interesting. Okay, so now this chat log also locks at this time. And what I really like about this, besides enforcing the lateness, is that I've often talked about discussion boards being an archive of where students' minds were at a certain time, where their growth was, to just sort of just capture that almost like as in a photograph at that time. And, inevitably, people's ideas are going to change from what they originally wrote in this this. As they start researching the topic, they're going to get more nuance with their idea. And isn't it nice that they can go back later and see how much their idea grew from that initial ideation log? So then, what I would do here is, Anne, how do you use the links in portfolios? Do you share the private links? So I want to talk about.
I've done it a couple of different ways. I do share the private. You mean to share out the entire portfolio?
Yep.
Yes. And so typically in the K-12, we don't like the kids to make them public, except to course members and to the instructors. So we might have an assignment where they will go into the create mode and actually post their links on a page. Sometimes the kids, depending upon what else goes along with that link, they might post them in discussion threads and so forth. So there's a variety of different ways depending upon the circumstances.
So I would, as part of this project management, ask everyone to go create their portfolio. They don't have to put anything in at this point. I just want them to share it with me. So now I have this special place just to get their work. It's still private. It's only shared with me. And that's pretty cool. To see what that looks like, here's our portfolio. Notice I haven't added anything to it yet, but you go up the level to where you see all of your portfolios, click the three dots, share portfolio. By default, portfolios are not published. Only the student, only the person logged in is going to see their portfolio until they click this green dot, right? So maybe we're going to do that at the very end. Back in the day, back in the analog day, when you would display student work out on paper, in the digital world, you might be publishing portfolios that are shared, but this can stay unpublished. Yet they can still grab this private share link and then submit it to the assignment. Now you have a collection of everyone's portfolios. So if they ever have a question, you can jump right into them and check them out, see where the progress is.
And take a
go
look
ahead.
at that the way we often will take a page and just post them all on one single page, so they have one stopping ground for access to everyone's. Is nice. The kids like that.
Absolutely, and I think that's what I would do as a next step, especially when things were done, is either create a page and I could take those links myself and post them here. And what's interesting about this, let me show you something kind of cool about this. Obviously, students can be very sensitive about their work, especially if they're taking some risks on content. If I go and look at this portfolio, oh, sorry, let me just go into an incognito window here. If I look at this portfolio here, what do I not, do you notice that something is missing here in a good way? So I'm asking you to be mind readers, but there's this important piece missing here. If someone just uses that private link. Notice that there's no name attached. When you look at that link, you won't necessarily see whose it is sometimes when you view a private link. So it can also be an interesting way to do peer review or a blind review as well, if you wanted to share them more anonymously.
And can we use settings to lock that down as well on an individual level? I know we can at the system level.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Just check it. Yeah. So that's one way to do it if you wanted to collect them all yourself and put them in a page. Other people have made a final project discussion and had all the students post a link to their own portfolio. They would take care of that piece and have the opportunity to say a little bit something about it. That is also interesting to get feedback on as well. which brings us really to our last piece here. And you mentioned the idea of Google Forms. Well, if we are creating this capstone project, after we create the whole thing, make all this amazing content, well, there's no reason students can't also, students should be Google literate. They should know how to make a Google form. They should be able to make their own Google form, feedback form, pop it right in their portfolio. Each student can have their own feedback form to get feedback on their portfolio. Right? They could really take ownership of that piece of it.
Great idea.
Which gets really interesting. And of course, the big piece here, which we haven't talked about, we haven't talked a lot about assessment in this session, not as much, certainly not as much as we could. But notice in our description of this capstone project, she's pretty much provided a rubric for this to be built. So as a final step here, some of you have to probably have to get going. But as a final step here, let's do this. If I was teaching, this would probably be one of the first things I would do. It's often, and while I do this, talk to me a little bit about this, because I think it's often a very good practice, even before you make any content, to set up your rubrics and to set up your learning objectives.
Right, and it's nice to be able to do that and collaborate. And once you create a rubric in Schoology, you can have your system administrator put that in and make it available for everyone. And so we do that. For instance, our Phi Ed department does it for their rubric. So you can share it among individuals, you can share it among groups, or you can post it at a system level. And then the greatest thing now is you can take those rubrics and you can copy from course section to course section.
Yes, I love that too.
I love that.
And now notice that this is supposed to be 10 points of the total 100 points. So I would probably spend some time later, if I was really sitting down and doing this and making good descriptions here so people have an idea of what a 10 really looks like. But for the purposes of this, I could definitely just change these and come back to it later, adding and subtracting cells as needed. Remember, in a Schoology rubric, I don't necessarily need a 5 here to enter a 5. You don't have to put in every number, which is something that I like. Now, I'm building it this way. Anne, would you maybe go about it a different way? Would you possibly build learning objectives into this?
I could even build multiple rubrics, believe it or not, to use. So some could be with the conventions and the overall design. Some could be related, or one of them could be related to more just outcome and content. So there's multiple ways that you could do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's so many different ways. So I'm going to, what I'm going to do? I'm just going to leave this here. We have 2 rows of those rubrics. And for those of you who haven't seen this, this is where things get pretty interesting. There's my rubric. Again, those of you who seem to be very interested in resources, well, we talked about in the beginning of this how we wanted to get the overview of the whole course and understand the course objectives. Well, what if we pulled in some of these big objectives here? Let me just go grab a few of these. If you really want to be, if you want to go to a Schoology party and really impress people,
Exactly.
This is what you do. You don't go in your course first. You go into your resources, into learning objectives. Check this out. Humanities. Create. I got a little folder there. Custom learning objectives. Okay, you notice this. You saw we have state standards. I think a lot of you on the call already know that we have Common Core, state standards, all that stuff. Well, that doesn't cut it, especially in higher education, especially for custom courses. You want the course level objectives, right? Or the objectives for the modules, depending on how you plan on evaluating. Okay. Title, description. Sometimes people get hung up on these. Often titles are codified, but sometimes people like making titles that are a little more human readable. That is certain. I would say that that's a very long and complicated conversation for another time. Anne, what do you think?
I think so.
The codification. I mean, that sounds like a really exciting webinar, guys. The codification of learning objectives. If that sounds exciting to you, we're probably friends. Okay, so I have some learning objectives there. I won't make all of them. But what this allows me to do, and this can be the sort of brain explosion that happens at this point, is that instead of being in my rubric just typing in these criteria one by one, now this is linked into my learning objectives. I can come into my custom learning objectives. I organize them just in my own personal resources, but they can be organized in your group resources with your curriculum. And bam, there are those 2 learning objectives I created. And I can, change the point values to, whatever I want. Now that seems pretty cool. It makes it really standard. It makes it very measurable. And what other superpower benefit am I getting from scoring upon learning objectives instead?
Well, you're able to see how your students are mastering the objectives that they're responsible for. And, one thing to remember from the system administrator side is that if you've got content standards that aren't necessarily state standards, they might be discipline-specific standards and things like that, you can have your system administrator upload those for you so you don't have to go to the work. Schoology has populated the objectives very, very well, but there are some just content-specific ones, and that's a nice way also to get that information in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I made a classic newbie mistake, forgot to set my grading category. So embarrassing. Okay, Laura, thank you for volunteering here.
Did you mention mastery then at that point? We're being able to monitor that?
Exactly. So watch what happens here. Exactly what Anne is saying, the idea of measuring and monitoring these. Here I just scored Laura on using the rubric we just created. Remember, these ones up here I just typed in by hand what I think of as sort of ad hoc criteria. These ones I formalized and made formal, learning objectives with. So what happens is that as I score her, we look in our mastery report instead of just the grade book. And there she is. There's the score. So now I actually can view my whole class upon how they are performing on these different objectives in the course. And that's really where you get into mastery learning and understanding standards. We love talking about standards and how important they are, but if you went and asked someone, well, how is so-and-so doing at speaking and listening, and this very specific speaking and listening, it's like, I can give you anecdotal information, but the Mastery Dashboard actually gives you really specific information pulled out of your rubrics and anywhere you're tagging learning objectives, so you can see it in one place. And boy, does this give you information. Not only information how to further personalize learning, but as a wrapping up point, biggest, one of the keystone concepts in course design is evaluation and redesign. Absolutely. I find the Mastery Report gives me so much information on how I can design this course better.
and I can dig into specific learning activities that are attached to those objectives and know exactly which ones need redesign or further differentiation for specific learners. And I can also individually assign remedial activities for those students that are behind or needing additional support for certain objectives.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a really great place to wrap up. We had a lot of fun here. We just kept the line open and kept going past our time. I'm glad that almost all of you stayed with us today. This session has been recorded, as well as this morning's session that talked a little bit more about the design side, about the pre-work that happens. Excuse me, a lot of you are in this course. I'm going to still keep toying with this course over time, and we'll release it. We'll let you all have access to it. You have, I think, have access to the resources we used to create this. A lot of you have joined as a student, which means, you know, maybe in a week you'll be emailing me leap@schoology.com to kick you out of the course. You might not want it in your course drop down forever, but I'll also archive it so it gets out of your way. This has been a lot of fun. I'm just going to take a quick look over here at my other monitor as I've been doing today to check out last questions. Okay, and if you, Jacob, hit me up on email and we'll follow up immediately after this. And thank you. And just a couple other questions here. Yes, and what I'll do is when both recordings are processed, I'll just post them directly to this course even before they go up on YouTube, so you all have access to them. Anne, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It was fun.
It has been a pleasure talking the talk, getting into the weeds with you.
Awesome experience. Thanks a bunch.